and worlds filled with monsters refusing to be put down. Few are as dangerous or sadistic as Overlord. Whether it's Doomsday continuously rising from the ashes against Superman, Nemesis pursuing his targets relentlessly, or the T-1000 looking to end the human resistance, few things are more terrifying than the threat that is nearly impossible to stop. Prepare to enter a world where not even death could keep this monster down. This is the dark side of Transformers, the story of Overlord. First joining the world of Transformers in the Super God Masterforce series in 1988, Overlord is the Decepticon Ambassador of Destruction. First introduced as the largest Transtector halfway through the series, the history of Overlord would first begin with the married couple Mega and Giga, and with their servitude to the Decepticon god Devil Z, chosen by the malevolent being and bonded with the largest of the Transtectors as God Masters. They would now be able to do the bidding of the Supreme Leader of Darkness, hunt down the other Transtectors, and attempt to destroy humanity. After multiple failed attempts at defeating the Autobot Godmaster Jinrai, the pair would join forces and combine in their Overlord form, and handedly beat down the Autobot leader. As Overlord, the couple would become a walking war machine, comprised of the Mega Jet and Giga Tank, and outfitted with a slew of weaponry as they waged war against Jinrai, Grand Maximus, and the rest of the Autobots. Not only is Overlord a hulking behemoth, he's also a phenomenal strategist, thanks to the piloting of Mega and Giga. These moments of brilliance would see Overlord baiting Jinrai into battle as the Seacons attempt to destroy the Autobot base, sacrificing the Transtectors in battle to cripple their enemies. While the plan would ultimately fail, the next ploy, known as Operation M1, would have some truly unintended consequences. With the return of the Titan Black Zarek, the pair would be tasked with destroying major metropolitan areas across the globe. Black Zarek would start in New York, decimating the Big Apple, while Overlord would begin the onslaught in Paris, until damaging the Great Wall of China and landing in Tokyo to obliterate the city. While an errant shot from both the massive Decepticons would stop their reigns of terror, it would also serve as a driving force for Devil Z's disgust for humanity and the pending demise of Mega and Giga. After merging with Black Zarek, Devil Z would begin to forcibly change his Decepticon regime as his hatred for humans grew. While convinced he would need to use his devil powers to wipe out the planet, he would showcase his abilities as he recreated the Decepticon Godmasters Hydra and Buster, stripping them of their human forms and merging them with their Transtectors. Mega and Giga would revisit their alliances, refuse to follow Devil Z's plans, and no longer treat Jinrai as a hated enemy, and instead fight him as an honorable rival. When Hydra and Buster would fail, Overlord would come to their defense against their former master, briefly switching sides to the Autobot cause, only to be defeated by Devil Z, stripping Mega and Giga of the Mega Jet and Giga Tank, and ending their lives by severing the connection to the Transtectors. But Overlord's story wouldn't end here, as the Decepticon god would resurrect Overlord as a now sentient being who, after Devil Z and Black Zarek are destroyed, would become the Decepticons' new leader until relinquishing leadership to Death Source before the start of Transformers Victory, and returning in Transformers Zone as an even larger threat as the strongest of Violent Joggers' 9 great demon generals. In Zone, Overlord would be responsible along Abominus and Menasor for the destruction of the planet Femenia, mortally wounding the Autobot leader Victory Saber, and leading an attack against the Micromasters base on Zone, until being defeated by Atlas. While this would be the end of Overlord's story in the Japanese Transformers anime series, and play a major role in the manga series that was released simultaneously. Introduced as the leader of the Decepticons, would still be piloted by Mega and Giga, yet would face more issues with the Decepticons while battling Jinrai and the Autobots. While Overlord would commit some truly heinous acts as the Decepticon commander, he'd also stop Black Zarek from using the Decepticon Headmaster Jr. Cancer as a bargaining tool, and set up a final confrontation between the two Decepticon monstrosities. In this final battle, Black Zarek would merge with Devil Z and begin draining the life force of their fellow Decepticons, until Overlord would join forces with the Autobots to stop this menace. But by defeating Devil Z, Mega and Giga would also sacrifice the power they are granted by the Decepticon god, in turn, end their own lives, as Overlord would gain sentience and regain control of the Decepticons in memory of Giga, while Transformers Super God Masterforce would introduce Overlord as a Transtector combiner complete with a human element. More recent incarnations of the character would take a much different approach. In the version introduced by Fun Publications, Overlord would be known as Gigatron, and focus on obtaining rarefied energon, until coming face to face with the evil Autobots of the Shattered Glass universe. In the Prime Wars trilogy, Overlord would pledge his allegiance to Megatronus in exchange for power, using his newfound strength to defeat the Mistress of Flame, corrupt the spark of Rodimus Prime, creating Rodimus Kron, sever the head of Menasor with his bare hands, and would only be defeated after being shot with the legendary Requiem Blaster. While the versions introduced by Fun Publications and the Prime Wars trilogy are interesting takes on the character, few can compare to the one introduced in the IDW Comics continuity. Born a 0.1%er, Overlord would use his size as a tool as a gladiator in the pits of Kaon, defeating all who crossed his path except for the Decepticon leader Megatron, instilling within him a fear of losing, and getting him to join the Decepticons to hone his skills in battle. While a member of the faction, Overlord would spar with Megatron and join the Warriors Elite program, granting him incredible durability and strength, which, like the other Warriors Elite, Overlord would be implanted with a kill switch and the Achilles virus to ensure he could not harm Megatron, causing strain between the two behemoths. But with these failsafes enacted, Megatron would yet again try to control Overlord, insisting he become a Phase 6er, and when he refused, he would slaughter a slew of Autobots, defect from the Decepticons, and land himself on the DJD's list. While on the run, he'd invade the Garrus 9 prison, offline Skyquake, torture the Warden Fortress Maximus, and drive Grimlock insane, in an attempt to bait Megatron to pursue him, and for his own sadistic pleasures. Overlord would turn the prison into a fight club, promising freedom to those who survived 12 bouts to the death, but this freedom was a lie, as in their final test, they could choose the daunting task of facing Overlord or snuff out their own spark. As many Autobots were held prisoner in these horrendous conditions, Reckers would seek to save those held captive, but Overlord would be able to fend off the attack by the team with ease, resulting in the death of Rotorstorm. But the Wreckers would return. Here, they would harpoon Overlord's eye, pepper him with blaster spray, and inject him with explosives. Nothing deterred him, even as Overlord was reduced to a flaming skeleton. Following this battle, and upon learning that Megatron had died, Overlord would allow himself to be taken prisoner, and through a series of events, would land himself aboard the Lost Light during the quantum explosion, which would create two identical copies of the ship and the crew, and ultimately ending up in the sights of the DJD, while the Decepticon Justice Division would track down one version of the Lost Light crew and obliterate everything on board. They'd leave another identical version of Overlord floating out in space, alive and suffering in a slow cell aboard the other Lost Light, biding his time. Overlord would escape using techniques learned when overcoming the Achilles virus, upon finding out that Megatron was still alive, and would lay waste to those aboard the Lost Light. During his rampage, Overlord would be jettisoned from the ship with a tortured rewind and fired upon, leaving him floating through the cold darkness of space. While he would be recovered and rebuilt by the Galactic Council, he would also be given the opportunity to finally defeat Megatron. Working alongside Tarn and Deathsaurus, the trio and their troops would wage battle against the Lost Light crew on the Necro world, as a means to face off with the now Autobot-affiliated Megatron. But the battle would never arrive, as Overlord would see Megatron as a coward for not fighting, and ending the one-sided rivalry that cost so many lives. But this wouldn't be the end for Overlord. Instead, he would meet the mad scientist Tarantulas and be granted a new human alt mode, which would allow him to masquerade as Megan Giglione, an earthbound politician against the Council of Worlds and Cybertron, and adding political manipulation to his list of sins. The partnership would be short-lived, and would result in Tarantulas being offline by Overlord after his true identity was uncovered. Ultimately, this would allow the Wreckers one last shot at Overlord, as Springer and Impactor would utilize Tarantulas' Time Maze to split Overlord into his Megajet and Gigatank alt modes, and send both components to opposite ends of the timeline, ending his reign of terror across the cosmos. What lies ahead for Overlord is unknown, with his last appearance in Transformers media occurring during the Prime Wars trilogy in 2018. Little is known about the Decepticons' future. With all that being said, what are your thoughts on Overlord's legacy, and where do you want to see him pop up next? Thanks for watching, and as always, stay handsome.